The 1792 City Plan of Washington, D.C. is an artifact. It is also a historical document. It exists. It is not a description or our memory. The city mapped out on the artifact is virtually the exact same thing laid out on the ground. Symmetry appears to be the rule, but sometimes it is the asymmetries that led to an even greater design hidden in the plan. It is an important artifact because it also functioned as the primary reference for building the city during the 19th century. In the end, it was faithfully represented on the ground. This document is also an artifact of pure mind and imagination. It is a snapshot of what a capital city for this nation should look like. The mission of President Washington and his first planning commission was to make a city that was worthy of a nation. But that appears to be all that we know. Exactly why the city looks like it does is not part of the historical record. Sacred geometry was chosen as a tool to examine the plan. Its great advantage as a forensics tool is that this kind of geometry is based on perfection. It makes perfect geometric constructions and houses a huge array of proportional constants. Sacred geometry provides replicable and quantitative data. It is a perfect standard for exploration because it epitomizes a standard based on perfection. Sacred geometry was also a tradition known the world over for thousands of years. It is famous in the West because it is the same geometry you had to know before you could enter Plato's school in classical Greece. It was especially celebrated by the Freemasons, and many other intellectual and philosophical societies in late 18th century Europe, including the colonies during the Revolutionary era. The two triangles from the Great Seal held the key. Nature's connect the dot geometry is on full display with the star hexagram. The hexagon is both the easiest polygon to make and the first one you discover when learning the process. The Star of David is a hexagram. Once it is drawn up on paper, you then erase everything except the intersecting points in the center. Isolating the intersections of the hexagram produces this design. This design is also a double tetrachys. A tetrachys is a symbol going back to the days of Pythagoras. Think of a bowling pin arrangement, and you have a tetrachys. Overlap two of them in opposite directions and you have a double tetrachys in the shape of a Star of David, which is a hexagram, a six-pointed star. When combined, there are 13 points, one each for the original states. Joseph Campbell, scholar of world mythologies, describes the apex dot of the construction as the creative center, out of which the universe and all things have come. Joseph Campbell continues from the book, The Power of Myth, 1988. So what I suddenly realized, when I recognized that in the Great Seal, there were two of these symbolic triangles interlocked, was that we now had 13 points for our 13 original states, and that there were now, furthermore, no less than 6 apexes, one above, one below, and 4 to the 4 quarters. The sense of this, it seemed to me, might be that from above or below, or from any point of the compass, the creative word might be heard, which is the great thesis of democracy. Democracy assumes that anybody from any quarter can speak, and speak truth, because his mind is not cut off from the truth. All he has to do is clear out his passions, and then speak. So what you have here on the dollar bill is the eagle representing this wonderful image of the way in which the transcendent manifests itself in the world. That's what the United States is founded on. If you're going to govern properly, you've got to govern from the apex of the triangle, in the sense of the world eye at the top. The pyramid and the vesica piscis. The pyramid triangle is also located in the vesica piscis. It is an isosceles triangle with base angles of roughly 70 degrees, with an apex of about 40 degrees, plus or minus a degree. The geometric symbols in the Great Seal are very simple to construct with sacred geometry. In fact, they can be derived as soon as the vesica piscis is formed. Discussing the symbols of the Great Seal during the PBS project, The Power of Myth, Joseph Campbell and Bill Moyers begin talking about reason. Campbell: no, you have to distinguish between reason and thinking. Moyers: distinguish between reason and thinking. If I think, am I not reasoning things out? Campbell: yes, your reason is one kind of thinking, but thinking things out isn't necessarily reason in this sense. Figuring out how you can break through a wall is not reason. The mouse who figures out, after it bumps its nose here, that perhaps he can get around there, is figuring something out the way we figure things out. But that's not reason. Reason has to do with finding the ground of being, and the fundamental structuring of order of the universe. So when these men talked about the eye of God being reason, they were saying that the ground of our being as a society, as a culture, as a people, derives from the fundamental character of the universe. Campbell, that's what this first pyramid says. This is the pyramid of the world, and this is the pyramid of our society, and they are of the same order. This is God's creation, and this is our society. The Vesica Piscis became the primary model to decode the city. It was a logical choice since the same model was used to derive the two primary geometric shapes on the Great Seal. The Vesica Piscis is the source of the two types of triangles represented on the 1782 Great Seal, the pyramid triangle, and the hexagram triangle. Each type of triangle turns up as our natural pair within the confines of the two circles. What might be critically important is that they turn up at the very beginning of the sacred geometry process. Symbolically, it could mean that the two triangles in the Great Seal were chosen because they are directly tied into the beginning of creation, and the origins of the manifested world. Did the triangles represent the creation of a new form of government, where the people rule through their elected representatives instead of a royal monarchy? The Vesica Piscis became the primary model to decode the city. I tried an experiment. A string of circles was laid out along the east-west axis dividing them all. As explained in part 1, the radius chosen was a 1/2 mile. From this radius, all circles were drawn by just walking the compass using the half-mile radius. This creates a circle that is a mile wide. Since the capital mile was highly symbolic, it seemed like a 1/2 mile radius was worth a try. The two triangles were exactly defined by the radial avenues on either side of the capital. Even more surprising was looking at the top of the modern pyramid. The pyramid eye symbol includes the Western Terrace, the site of the presidential inauguration. Nobody has ever made the connection between the inauguration and the landscaping of the west side of the Capitol. That is because nobody has ever pointed out the strange similarity with the Eye of Reason symbol. If this landscaping is just a coincidence of maintaining symmetries within a limited area, then the resemblance would have other implications. If this area has been landscaped to resemble the Eye of Reason, then it has been a secret kept from the public. When examined in this light, the Eye of Reason and its triangle is a bit easier to consider when weighing the fact that the larger triangle it is attached to actually stretches for 13 city blocks and placed squarely between the White House and the Capitol. Two triangles involved with the symbology of the Great Seal of the U.S. have been located along the east-west axis of Washington, D.C., on either side of the Capitol. On their own, the triangles were virtually perfect fits accommodated by radiating avenues originating at the Capitol. What about other parts of the city? What about the area north of the White House? We turn our attention now to the northwest section. This is the sector for the White House. The neighborhood north of the White House holds several new secrets hiding in plain sight. The door to these hidden symbols and designs begins with the suspicious star pointing south, pointing down at the White House, and landing on the front steps. The geometry of the triangles from the Great Seal was different from that of the star. It is important to note that a number 5 pointed stars on the Great Seal in 1782. In fact, there was a policy that 5 pointed stars were not to be used in heraldry. The only stars you could use were 6 pointed or more. Pentagrams were not even allowed to be used. So what is this star doing poised above the White House? Why would anyone put that kind of star there? Even back in 1792, such a star would suggest a satanic undercurrent. Symbols like this were popularly known, for instance, in the tarot card deck since the Middle Ages. Regardless of your philosophy, there is a sense of bad taste, especially if you are a Christian. And if you are a Freemason or a deist, Why would you want to bait anti-Masonic and anti-pagan Christians? It doesn't make sense. It is so obvious, and so in your face, that I expected to find a couple of centuries worth of comments by Christians about that terrible star dangling above the president's house. I found no historical commentaries at all from the 19th and early 20th century. Nothing. Or did no one seem to notice? Perhaps the public and city planning staffs just accepted the star feature as a fancy but benign Baroque decoration, accented by traffic circles and squares. Maybe its function was to celebrate the northern approach to the White House. The star would then turn out to be a pentagram with no symbolic resonance beyond the merely aesthetic. In Part 1, it was noted that according to Masonic law and beliefs, that the northwest direction is a negatively charged sector. This quadrant is notoriously known for evil, which is represented by the north, and death, which is represented by the west. Masons are still scratching their heads about why Freemason George Washington would ever choose that quadrant of the city as the home of the White House. He selected it. He insisted on it. Why? There were plenty of other locations in the eastern part of the city that were safe from floods. Or was it because the property afforded a view of his Mount Vernon home? All I know is that for Freemasons, a northwest location for the White House is still a head spinner. So, what do you think? Is Satan's star really hovering above the White House? As the question suggests, the star above the White House is one of the most controversial features in the plan. This seems to be a recent development. It seems that only in the last 20 years has this star risen to national prominence, mostly by Christians who associate Freemasonry with the devil. I figure it is probably Alex Jones' fault. Hell, everything else is. Until I find out differently, history does not seem to have captured any discussions about this obvious, in-your-face, upside-down star, equated throughout the world and Hollywood as bad news from the nether regions. Over here, witchcraft immediately comes to mind. Probably Charlie Manson too. The devil sign has been made world famous on popular decks of fortune-telling tarot cards and countless comic books. It is a cultural icon. Early on someone told me that the star is also a sign of protection, and they are worn by police. This was an excellent point, and it removed the seemingly inescapable confines of Satan, namely the point of the star dangling above the front door of the White House. What if it was all a matter of perspective? If the Northwest Quad is really a negative region for Freemasons, could the star serve as some sort of protective talisman built to shield the White House from those negative forces? President Washington selected the quad for the White House specifically. He knew the job was dangerous when he took it. Is this star part of a design manufactured as a good luck charm or some such? Does it function to counterbalance the negatively charged Northwest region that Washington inherited with his choice? It might be a matter of perspective. Looking at the map, which is traditionally oriented with north at the top, some of us see the suspicious star pointing menacingly at the White House, an immediate threat, so to speak. Riddles in Stone, a pop video on the city's design and symbols, made sure the viewer made the Satan connection. Every time they showed the star on screen, they would play a Jaws-like music theme. Menacing, all by itself. No narrative was necessary. You, the audience, were left to your own devices, alongside the satanic soundtrack. Well, it was all just a cheap trick because they were out to make a quick buck by labeling President Washington and the planners as closet Satanists. It is really pretty disgraceful. You will know what I mean when you see what the star is really about. This is usually where recent discussions stop. It's a satanic star. Enough said. Freemasons are Satanists. End of story. The radical Christian right celebrates and goes home. There are only a handful of researchers who really believe this, but somehow it seems they always manage to get on TV. It does not matter that the star is distorted. For them, the superficial is so obvious, why question it? They call the star north of the White House satanic because that is the way they want to see the star. But in order to see a satanic star, you have to distort it. The popular idea is that the star is distorted because it is an attempt to deceive, which after all, would be normal because that is what the devil does. But this is all presumption. You are second-guessing the designer. And in the world of magic, is it even possible to distort a symbol and give it different angles and proportions? Is not the power in the angles themselves? So when you change the shape, What if you also change its power and effectiveness? Like I said, this line of questioning is all guesswork, and conclusions seem to have been made before any strict consideration of the evidence itself. Other researchers, who are not obsessed with this strange feature, do not make these same spurious claims. In fact, most seem to ignore it, and bypass the star altogether in favor of other patterns and constructions that are possible in the streets and avenues north of the White House. The major problem for me was, I was maintaining a strict, Zen-like approach to the geometry. This meant that I could not presume that the planners distorted their geometric shapes. The Great Seal symbols next to the capital suggested the opposite. These are almost perfectly proportioned shapes. If this was supposed to be a satanic star, why did they distort it? It is short and squat. Why? I could only work with what was on the page. I could not presume to second-guess the motives of the planners. All I could look at was the geometry. And in geometry, angles matter. They are not to be fooled around with, not when you are attempting to explore scientifically within the perfect borders of sacred geometry. Why, then, was this star distorted? Where did it come from? It certainly was not on the Great Seal. In 1792, there were rules of heraldry that allowed only stars with 6 or more points. The 5-pointed star was used for flags representing the 13 colonies, but so were 6 and 8-pointed stars. The bottom line is, with respect to the short and squat star north of the White House, it has no equal among the stars of the Revolutionary War and the First Government. I have yet to find it exhibited anywhere else. It was a huge question. Did this exact kind of star have a sacred geometry origin, or was it just a whimsical star pattern with no special geometric origin at all? It might be true that history will never provide the hows and the whys of the plan, but with this geometry, it was really hoped to at least expose the what of the design when it related to sacred geometry. The 5 points are made up of intersection hubs for numerous radial avenues. The almost completed pentagram is surrounded by an almost completed pentagon. There is no avenue that connects Logan Circle with Mount Vernon Square. As a researcher, we can also turn the map around and orient it to the south. Traditionally, this was the way the Chinese oriented their maps, with south at the top. What about the idea that the star could represent our talisman of protection? Stars are often associated with protection, for example, the police, sheriffs, and the military, etc. The star is also the badge of law and order, generally civil. Worn on the chest or in a wallet, it is the sign of protection of the status quo, city, county, state, and federal. This is one explanation. I call it the devil's advocate explanation. So, could it be that, the function of this star that is pointed at the doorstep of the White House, could it have had a protection function? Recall what I said before about the northwest quad being a bad, evil, deathly direction. It is apparently the worst direction for a Freemason. Yet, here is the White House that Washington himself insisted on. There are no writings about this decision. But a bad quadrant is a bad quadrant. It was then, and it still is. So I ask again, could the star be a protection against the evil northern forces of Masonic mythology? What if the star is a protection against the northern forces? To appreciate this idea, you must take the devil's advocate perspective. The northern approach to the White House affords the devil's advocate view. This is how the devil would see the terrain as he approaches to threaten the White House and the city. He comes storming out of the north, with his trusted advocate by his side, and then he balks as he sees this tremendous star preventing his advance, a star that shields the White House. As a matter of perspective, the star is now a force shielding the White House from the evil influences. For the bad influence storming out of the north to do you harm, when they arrive at the city, the star is now right side up, and it is shielding the good guys from your nefarious plans. This is at least a possible explanation for the positioning of this pentagram. It is a protection talisman. This is a third alternative orientation of the plan for Washington, D.C. oriented east. It celebrates the most important direction in Freemasonry, and it is probably the most important direction among most peoples of the world since it celebrates the rising sun. In Washington, D.C., it is the orientation where we have the correct view of the geometric symbols next to the Capitol. If this was the true orientation of the plan, then it would dispel any notion of evil stars pointing down at the White House. In this case, with an eastern orientation, you have a star pointed to the south, to the White House, and to the Washington Monument. It is also another piece of speculation that will be discussed later. Right now, the most important thing is to try and find the geometric identity of the squat star. Where does it come from? The White House star is very different from the perfect pentagram. Does the difference matter? Is any kind of pentagram pointed upside down a bad omen? Or is this reserved only for the perfect pentagram? Or what if it was a symbol of protection from the negative influences from the north, and therefore, a positive symbol? Or is this pentagram design what the Historical Society and architects have been telling us all along? That this star is nothing special symbolically. It was probably just an arrangement that fit a given solution at the moment. For me, there was no way of telling. Again, we can only speculate about meaning. There is no history discussing the design's components in this plan. My interest was geometry, and thanks to the non-history of the design, I might as well have been working with a lost city. I wanted to know where this pentagram, this distorted and squat pentagram, came from. Or was it just dreamed up by the planners without any special geometric connection whatsoever? What I discovered was that stars come in all shapes and proportions from multiple origins. Finding this exact star, if it even existed, was a daunting task. There was a single clue: the crossing arms of the White House star intersect at 90-degree angles. These perpendicular angles are missing from the perfect pentagram. The same perpendicular pattern turned up with the star derived from a hexagon, but there was still a big problem: the proportions were all wrong. This hexagram star was not an exact fit. A candidate for the White House star was located inside the octagon. An octagram is the star inside the octagon. It is an interesting shape since you can draw the entire star without lifting your pen. To make an octagon, you begin with quartering the circle to make the square. The diameter bisects the circle into two equal halves. Using the diameter as the radius, you swing a couple of arcs that exposes the point that divides the circle into 4 quarters. Making the octagon. Using the 4 points around the circle, you use a radius to draw 4 additional circles. These generate the points for an outer square. When you draw the X of the diagonals, they intersect the circle in 4 additional places. Connect the dots, and that is your octagon. Since the star seems to come from the octagon, the entire octagon model was superimposed on the northwest quad. Was the octagon used as the foundation for the northwest quadrant? It is fairly suggestive on the official 1792 map, but what about in the modern city? If the octagon really did serve as the foundation for the northwest quadrant, how did it fare when the city was actually built? This is the octagon superimposed on the modern city. Everything is pretty much the same. Furthermore, The octagon's northern points that are absent on the official plan may have been established by the later planners. Is it a coincidence? Were the 19th century planners just following the established symmetries? If an octagon was the foundation for the star, is there any evidence for the octagon beyond the star? New York and Rhode Island avenues run parallel and angle off to the northeasts. Massachusetts Avenue and Pennsylvania avenues veer off to the northwests. Connecticut and Vermont avenues, radiating directly from the White House, also follow the diagonals of the octagon. All three sets of pairs of avenues closely match the diagonal lines in the octagon. Also, a diagonal above Massachusetts Avenue running from the southwest to the northeast seems to define the northern boundary of the plan. There is also something else. The White House star was not alone. There are three others. The octagram design contains 4 stars exactly like the White House star. The 4 stars in the modern city. If the star really was a type of protection symbol, or talisman, the additional 3 stars may have added to that function. Presently, this is only speculation. What is not speculation is that sacred geometry, once again, has solved another unknown, the origin of the White House star. If it is not the solution, it is certainly a very strong hypothesis. If there is one word that seems to govern the design of Washington, D.C., it is symmetry. It is symmetrical to a fault. The octagonal foundation of the Northwest sector, or the Great Seal symbols around the Capitol, all support the notion that symmetry was a primary consideration. There are a few exceptions, but none are as great as the asymmetry of New Hampshire Avenue. It storms into this elegant layout, shooting up from the southeast and through the middle of the octagon, and then exits the design. It is all alone. It has no twin. This is New Hampshire Avenue in the modern city. It is virtually the same, though its northern termination has changed a bit. The direction, however, is exactly the same. What are we to make of this errant line? It just rudely intrudes on the elegant star-filled octagonal complex. It cuts clean through the northwest quadrant. What was the thinking behind it? What was its special function that allowed this break with the otherwise strict symmetry of the plan? New Hampshire Avenue was a real stumper. It was a rogue avenue. It looked like an accident. It had no relation to anything. But then I discovered I was mistaken. It does relate to the White House star. It forms one of the sides of the star's pentagon. This changed everything. This was the break I was looking for. The octagon seemed to fit seamlessly into the northwestern quad, but New Hampshire Avenue had been the spoiler. Without this rogue avenue, everything in the northwest would have been tidy, and more importantly, everything would have been symmetrical. But this rogue avenue did have a function. It was attached to the pentagon around the star. The star and its surrounding pentagon each have a missing link. Unlike the pyramid and the hexagram at the Capitol, the star and pentagon have missing sections. Still, it is probable that in the eyes of the planners, the star and pentagon was still a star and pentagon, regardless of the missing segments. As the star and pentagon demonstrate, the points were all marked with major intersection hubs. Realizing that New Hampshire Avenue closed the west side of the pentagon, I then began wondering about the east side of the star's pentagon. The missing link between Logan Circle and Mount Vernon Square. There is a trick in sacred geometry related to several polygons. If you start with a regular polygon and then, with a ruler, begin extending its sides, something interesting happens. Extending the polygon's sides generates scaled-up expressions of its internal structures. The hexagon is a good example. By extending the 6 sides, a larger hexagram is constructed. The same happens with a star. For example, let's start with the bad old, down-pointing Satan star and its pentagon. When you extend the sides, you soon discover that you have made the good kind of star that is pointing up. Every time you see Satan's star, the good star is surrounding it. By implication, the same thing is true of a good star. Extending the sides of the pentagon that is pointing upwards will result in another Satan star. Both stars are implied by their very existence. Now, we have been dealing with a geometric feature in the streets of Washington, D.C. that is, well, curious, to say the least. Of all the shapes located in the city, the star is the most prominent and eye-catching. It jumps out at you. The star is probably the feature that has caused the most double takes by people looking at the original plan, or an aerial photo for the first time. Regardless of what it might mean, if anything, it is just its presence that makes one stutter for an instant. The lesson of the White House star might be distilled down to the adage, as above, so below. We have a down-pointing star surrounded by its pentagon. What if the White House star is actually the center of a much larger star pointing to the north? This is a model of what we are going to try out on the streets north of the White House. The starting point is the pentagon surrounding the star. Each side is extended arbitrarily, across the page if need be. The lines just have to be long enough to intersect with the other lines. You are making no personal choices here. Everything is already predetermined. The only job is to draw the lines. You are simply examining a geometrical feature. This model could be a way to test a hypothesis. Overlaid onto the modern city, the result is pretty impressive. The White House star appears to be the center of a larger star pointed in the appropriate direction. Without an actual avenue, a string of intersections forms a phantom avenue that completes a huge star that covers the northwest sector. Its path runs through two major intersections and connects to the Capitol. Both feet of the star are anchored by the east-west axis. Since I am not a Freemason, I do not understand the nature of their symbology. There were other societies of the day, and this type of star might have had some currency among those in the know. I can only guess that the stars might have a particular significance since they are all the product of the octagon, which is itself a product of the square. Each polygon has a family of designs, which are built into the original structure. Essentially, you can build a taxonomy of sacred geometry shapes using different polygons. 99% of what you will encounter in the cultural fields of geometry will be derived from the perfect triangle, the perfect square and the perfect pentagon, and all of these shapes have their roots in the perfect circle. The question remains, is it valid to conclude that the phantom avenue was intentional? Is it possible that it is just a happy accident? This strange model, based on the short and squat proportions of the White House star, is our natural result of drawing lines already provided by the star's pentagon. On the 1792 plan, the larger star flies off the map. Its western extremes are simple trajectories. The star that hovered above the White House is actually part of a much larger star that now hovers over the entire city. It is anchored on the east-west axis. The southeastern foot of the new star actually lands on the Capitol's dome. Recalling the negative aura surrounding the northwest quadrant, the opposite is true for the southeast. The southeast is primetime Freemason. If you cut the star into 4 quadrants, this foot would represent the southeast. The southwestern foot seems to stretch across the Potomac, towards Arlington. The original planners may have wanted to make the point that the city controlled the Potomac, but that's just another guess. What is true is that Arlington became the national cemetery. In Freemasonry, the West is death, but Arlington's choice for a national cemetery probably occurred as a result of the Civil War. Serendipity, anyone? The White House star, which may be a possible talisman designed to protect the presidential mansion, has now expanded. It has been scaled up to cover most of the northern half of the city. Its eastern arm extends beyond the Capitol, metaphorically shielding the prime institution from negative forces, like an umbrella shielding the rain. Well, maybe, maybe not. This is unknown ground, and it is a pretty good bet that if anyone knows about this, they are not talking. If on the other hand, somebody wants to argue that this feature is the result of blind chance, I am dying to see the statistical proof. This is the devil's advocate perspective. As we continue with this light-hearted metaphor, this is what the devil witnesses as the dark forces from the north attempt to invade the federal city. And now, it is not just a single star shielding the White House that is in his way. As he approaches, the devil is now surprised to find himself looking down the barrel of his very own Satan star. The discovery of these stars north of the White House goes to show that it is sometimes fruitful to appreciate multiple perspectives. The northwestern sector has taken on a new persona, based on the principles of sacred geometry. The White House star is actually part of two star patterns simultaneously. The relatively benign neighborhoods north of the White House are actually caught up in a giant octagon wonderland. If you view the east and west stars as pointing north, with their feet anchored to the corners on the street, they are distorted by perspective. It almost seems like a three-dimensional effect. Are they positioned to stand over the White House and stand guard, or is this where mythology and imagination lose their bearings? The star complexes are not part of the national family of symbols. They are something else. They are from a different quarter. My only suggestion has been that they might have functioned as some kind of protection, an urban talisman built into the city. Or perhaps, it is certainly possible to argue that it is all just an innocent coincidence. If the northwest sector was indeed laid out as an octagon, those were the angles and diagonals that the First Commission had to work with. The resulting star complexes may have been unintentional, and unrecognized by President Washington, Thomas Jefferson and the others involved. Like I mentioned before, being an outsider, I have no way of understanding just exactly what it is I stumbled across. I could not find a precedent in the Baroque or any other urban design tradition since the Dark Ages. Islamic, Hindu and other traditions may have employed sacred proportions when laying out their cities, but did they insert national or religious symbols into a city's road system before 1792? Just the same, they would be an unavoidable possibility found inside any octagon. Anywhere you lay down an octagon, you can make this design, or any part of it. Without historical documents, it can be treacherous to attempt to second-guess the planners, at least for me. Whether it is a Freemason protection strategy, or whether this was a common belief shared by the multiple minds who planned the city, it is simply not known at this time. Geometrically though, it is a very different story. Geometrically, the design fits like a glove. That's a fact. There might be other components to this area, but the presence of an octagonal framework in the northwest quadrant is hard to refute. It was found by locating the origin of the White House star. After that discovery, then it was just a simple matter of overlaying the model onto the streets of the official plan in the modern city. The combination of star elements on the 1792 official plan, the proportions are essentially the same. Most of the figure is built upon hypothetical trajectories. In the modern plan, many of the missing elements were incorporated into the new urban sprawl around the city. In this chapter, this is the situation we started with. At this point, the geometric figures were fairly balanced in terms of spatial sizes and their positioning. In the center, the pyramid triangle covers the National Mall between the White House and the Capitol. To the east of the Capitol, a six-pointed hexagram. To the north of the White House, there was a squat pentagram. Each institution had its own symbol, and both shared the pyramid. Looking at the map oriented to the east, we get a better sense of that balance. But this was just an illusion. The northwestern quadrant exploded, with two huge and intermingling designs springing out of the White House octagon. The huge star extends into the eastern half of the city, and it crosses the Potomac to the west. Both feet are firmly tied to the east-west axis. The four smaller stars in the octagon seem to form a circle within the northwest quadrant, as if part of a spherical matrix or dome. It is equally dramatic in the real city. There is no conflict or overlap between the various design elements. On the other hand, the octagonal star designs dwarf the two great seal symbols rather dramatically. The balance that seemed to be present at the outset of this chapter has now been terribly overwhelmed by the extravagant constructions in the northwest. In part 3, that will change slightly. There might be something else going on to the east of the hexagram. Actually, it just seems to swallow up the hexagram. Something strange was found on the official plan, in the place now called Lincoln Park. It was only found on this map. All other representations of this park, even before it was christened for the 16th president, show an ordinary rectangle, but not on Ellicott's revision. The official plan shows something else, something that is not symmetrical. Compared with what has come before, what lies ahead of you in part 3 is way off the reservation. It is not mathematical. I am not really sure what to call it, so I am not going to say directly what it might be. I will let you ponder it if you want to check it out. This is the clue. Lincoln Park, on the official 1792 plan. The Thakara Valance engraving does not have it, and no other map of the 19th or 20th century has the hint. Only the official plan has this little nugget. I am not going to tell you what to look for, and whatever you do, do not think of a bird's head. There is another suspicious feature over in the octagon. It is not very clear on the official version, but it is much clearer once you mill around in the center of the modern octagon. There are some who say that X never marks the spot. In this case, they would be wrong. All you have to do is go down to ground level and you will see something interesting. But you must agree that you will not think about circles and squares. Finally, we are going to have to tackle something akin to our nightmare. This is something that manifests itself when applying the as above, so below philosophy to the entire plan. I am not sure at all what it is, so I call him Boris, providing it is male. If it is female, we are going to have to work on an appropriate name. This very well could be my own private nightmare. Like everything else in this presentation, I have never seen it mentioned, but here it is. Take the official version, and then take its mirrored version, and connect them up. As above, so below. An easy thing to do. And yet, this thing shows up. So, we will meet Boris properly in the next chapter and try to figure out if this is as spooky as it seems to be on first glance. See you then.